I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. We're going to start today with some breaking news as the House is negotiating a continuing resolution through March. Will's going to walk us through the details of that. And Inez is going to cover the latest developments in the Pete Hegseth nomination. I will be talking about some January 6th related developments that dropped this week, namely that Liz Cheney has been accused of witness tampering. And then Ben will close us out with the Department of Justice reportedly snooping on members of Congress. So with that, Will, take it away.
So yeah, the new quote unquote continuing resolution just dropped, but it's anything but a continuing resolution. This is actually, a pretty substantial funding bill. It looks like there's at least 110 billion of new funding in terms of disaster. I mean, there's disaster, there's farm aid, there's continued funding for a variety of other things we're going to talk about in this continuing resolution that they expect everybody to vote for. And it's pretty ridiculous. There's been all this talk about, DOJ and government efficiency, and then Mike Johnson's dropping a 1,500-page monster on us, dropping it on his members of 3 days to do it. And it also includes a pay raise for Congress. And, generally, some of these things I'm not even opposed to. Like, I think we actually should have a substantial pay raise for Congress because we don't pay them enough to not be corrupt. That's the basic problem that I view with how it works. Singapore figured this problem out, right? You pay your public servants, top, basically peak nonprofit compensation, right? Comparable to, top nonprofit leaders, because they should be taking a discount for public service. But if they're not getting paid enough in terms of like being paid 150 grand while they have to manage 2 households, they're going to be looking for their next job. And looking for the next job when you're in control of $1 trillion budget means that you're going to have graft and corruption all over the place, which is instantiated by this bill here. They've managed to keep, not only are they funding themselves, are they funding like the farm bill? They're also continuing the funding of the Global Engagement Center, which is the State Department's censorship apparatus. And it's not clear exactly what they got in return from that and why Republicans should be expected to vote for this at all. And, we've had a bazillion clean continuing resolutions. There's no reason they couldn't just do another clean continuing resolution. There's some disaster aid in here for Florida because of the hurricanes, but that could also be a standalone bill and pass on its own. But they're merging it all together because clearly there's some unpopular stuff in here, and they're trying to use disaster aid as a carrot to force members to vote for it. I think it's gross. I think it's the last thing that Republicans should be doing in the run-up to Trump's inauguration. And I hope that Trump will be in a position to kind of thwart some of these spending priorities when he's president. So for example, one would hope that he could just simply not spend the money allocated to the Global Engagement Center and fire everybody involved, or, keep it nominally open with like a secretary and, one hardcore MAGA person running it. But who knows? Obviously not something to be happy about, but I'm curious about what y'all think.
Yeah, this certainly has the feel of the last feast of the hogs at the buffet a little bit in DC. And no doubt that is what's going through a lot of people's minds, that it's going to be a new era. And we can get into, not because Trump is a particular sort of cut the budget kind of guy, but because I think one of the reasons that Republicans keep losing these budget fights and why they're so afraid to take these budget fights to the public, they all have in their heads 2010, right? They all have in their heads the shutdown, the government shutdown that did not go politically well for Republicans, even though I thought it was wholly justified on the merits, right? That's what they're afraid of. And I think it's because Republicans don't do a very good job, in part because they can't, because what they're actually doing doesn't match up with this rhetoric. They can't tie the cuts to things that are unpopular, right? So they'll talk about shrinking government, but then they'll talk about cutting projects that sound very, even if they aren't, right, sound very like beneficial to the American public. And of course, Democrats always do a good job of playing that up. But there's a lot that the federal government spends on that is not just wasteful, but is actively pernicious. And I think Republicans would do a lot better to tie their budget cuts and potential position in these budget negotiations to some of the consequences, right? If you want to cut money from the Pentagon, then why don't you make a list of woke programs that the Pentagon is, spending money on? If you want to cut at the Department of Education, why don't you make it clear that a lot of this money is not going to education, right? The Department of Education doesn't educate a single student. This is going to bureaucrats to aggressively wield civil rights provisions in a way that is massively unpopular with the American public, such as redefining the word sex to mean gender identity, right? I think if we talk about budgeting priorities rather than as dollars and cents and as cuts, but actively preventing things that the American public clearly doesn't want, not only from polls, but from this recent election, I think Republicans will have a much better leg to stand on in future budget fights. But yes, all of these have been disappointing. All of these budget fights, there's not been a single time since 2010 that I can recall that Republicans have actually stood up for not just limited spending, but for even just trying to curb the government from funding our enemies. So I hope that will change with Trump coming in.
Yeah, I kind of have the same posture toward it as y'all. I'm not surprised that this is happening. It's sort of just super classic for Congress to wait till the last minute to pass this huge boondoggle. They love to do it right before Christmas because it's really easy to strong arm the other members into avoiding a Christmas shutdown. So you get these big pork bills filled with all kinds of what would typically be poison pills. And what Speaker Johnson has done is basically by keeping this to the last minute, he's avoided negotiating with the conservatives in his own party and instead is making deals with the Democrats because they're more likely to approve this massive spending bill. Although some Democrats are reportedly planning on voting against whatever the ultimate bill ends up being because there's a provision that either reduces or ends funding through military healthcare programs of gender transition surgeries for minors, which should be kind of obvious. But the fact that that's being touted as the big win for conservatives when everything else in the bill is against the conservatives is quite funny. It's sort of like, here, we'll throw you this culture war bone, but that's really all you get. But if there's any other benefit to this, this goes through March. Trump obviously is going to be in office starting on January 20th. You're going to have Doge with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. Elon Musk has already come out strongly against this bill. This potentially gives Republicans, and particularly conservative Freedom Caucus Republicans and Republicans who are interested in cutting government spending, the opportunity for something of a clean slate in the second half of the fiscal year under Trump. But that being said, the House Republicans haven't given any indication that they are actually serious about any of this. So even if Doge exercises some kind of influence externally, maybe Trump is kind of interested in pushing on these people as well. And then you've got the Freedom Caucus on the anti-increased government spending train. You still don't have enough of a majority to really get something done with the moderate Republicans who think that it's politically unpopular to either have a shutdown or cut government spending. So I just think it's going to be extraordinarily difficult for us to see a major sea change on this, even though there is this mandate that Trump has going in to the Oval in January.
I think we've all, and the American public, to the extent they're watching these machinations in Washington, we've all grown desensitized to omnibus bills masquerading as quote unquote continuing resolutions. I mean, this is larded up with pork. It's totally, there's so many different provisions that we've seen, and Vivek Ramaswamy and others have been sort of tweeting out some of the more egregious aspects in these bills, in this bill in particular, totally unmoored from core functions of government. 72 pages worth of pandemic preparedness and response. To Will's point, the egregious GEC extension when the GEC was supposed to die, an ignominious death, and I'll have a column out on the extension of the GEC and kind of the implications of this by the time this episode comes out, but obviously maddening and egregious and just a total self-own. And by the way, the reporting from Gabe Kaminsky, who broke a lot of the corruption news on GEC, is that there was horse trading with Senate Democrats who basically were going to modify some provision associated with another bill or how it's going to be applied, the CTA, which is sort of a business regulation, in exchange for extending the GEC. We'll see if there's more reporting on that. 17 different pieces of commerce legislation, Not just the pay raise for congressmen, but also being able to opt out of Obamacare for them. And on and on and on, all these different measures, again, unmoored from simply funding the government through March and then giving President Trump a chance to fulfill the mandate in hand in hand with Congress as well. Does this show lack of courage, of convictions, or is this actually where the Republican establishment is? I think that's an interesting question. That might end up being that it publicizes all the egregious things that happen in Washington and amplifies them, and that could ultimately maybe cause the political pressure and change necessary to actually stop the business as usual. I mean, Elon has said basically, you're in trouble in 2 years if you get behind this CR, quote unquote CR. If that's the case, and you actually see people get primaried as a consequence of getting behind unpopular bills in the eyes of MAGA world and the eyes of Elon and Vivek, that obviously could be meaningful. And he's shown that he can have a political impact, if nowhere else than in Pennsylvania, and obviously in buying X itself. So, to the extent that there could ever be change in Washington, having Elon as a huge megaphone here against kind of the swamp potentially could be very powerful. The last point that's worth making is there's a speaker fight coming out. There's already early reporting saying that Thomas Massie is a no on Speaker Mike Johnson 2.0, another term as Speaker. We could see a huge fight as a consequence of this potentially. So there's a question here of was the intent always essentially to basically pass a Democrat CR because that is what it might be in effect in terms of where the vote breaks out, or did the leadership not anticipate that there would be a massive rebellion among conservatives and maybe beyond conservatives in the conference? And was this potentially a fatal miscalculation that's not only going to lead to a messy fight right before the holiday season here, but also potentially now the fight for the speaker's life, essentially, as speaker? I guess we'll see in the coming days.
With that, we are going to move to our next topic. Inez is going to take us through the latest on the Pete Hegseth nomination and how this might be a rehash of Brett Kavanaugh-esque smears against one of Trump's big picks.
Yeah, so I think this is going to be a real test of whether or not the culture has truly shifted and whether the incentives have shifted. Pete Hegseth is obviously a very different person from Brett Kavanaugh. Brett Kavanaugh was squeaky clean to a fault. Pete Hegseth is not. He's a former military guy, a former combat guy, and shock of shocks. He had a few episodes where he drank too much after work, and he's certainly had some questionable sexual liaisons with married women. I mean, there is this real kind of over veneer of hypocrisy here. Anybody who spent any time in Washington, D.C. knows that the things that Pete Hegseth is even accused of doing are not uncommon among the people who will then be turning up their nose at his nomination in alleged moral superiority. However, there is the potential, right? So there's this subpoena out for his so far anonymous accuser, because the worst of the accusations is from this anonymous married woman who went to his hotel room. He says the encounter was consensual, the sexual encounter they had there while her husband was in the hotel. She says it was not consensual anonymously. So we have a potential Kavanaugh MeToo type situation that is coming up. Fortunately, we have senators so far saying that they're not going to give too much credence to anonymous accounts, but that they're waiting for the hearing. The hearing might show some fireworks. And I think this is an interesting crossroads for Democrats, right? Are they going to double down on using these kinds of sexual accusations as a political tool? Or are they going to realize that I think this tactic is played out? I think, at least from what's published so far, even anonymously, even the accusations, this is even less credible in some ways than Christine Blasey Ford. There's an obvious motive for the woman involved to call it non-consensual as opposed to consensual. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence that would go against her in terms of it being non-consensual. And I kind of think the country is sick of this, but I guess we'll see. I mean, even after the Kavanaugh nomination, that was a rallying point. I mean, it's hard to remember back, but that was a rallying point for Republicans, where even moderate Republicans finally had to go ahead and confirm Kavanaugh, because it was so clear that this was being politically weaponized, that he was being smeared in this ugly way, and that sexual accusations have become just one more arrow in the normal sling, the normal quiver of politics. And I think they have desensitized people to it. I know myself, like I now, when I hear one of these accusations come up in this particular context, I look at it with a very skeptical eye. And we're going to have to see. I mean, obviously, Hegseth's nomination rises and falls with Republicans, not with Democrats. And so we'll see if there are any Republicans who are still susceptible to this, or the other kinds of accusations about, heavy drinking or whatever. I personally, I can't help but see this through the lens of the fact that this guy has done a lot of interviews that I consider fantastic about how he is going to seriously clean up the top brass of the military. They have avoided responsibility for some of the most devastating foreign policy and military. And by military, I want to be very clear. I do not mean on the ground, boots on the ground, combat men and women fighting for the American armed forces. But in terms of decision making by the top military brass, some devastating and embarrassing failures over and over again, starting with the withdrawal and how that happened in Kabul. It sounds like Pete Hegseth is potentially going to bring some accountability to the top brass of a military who has gone without it for a very, very long time. And I can't help but see these accusations through that lens, but we'll see. I'm curious, how you think this is going to play out. Do you think that Democrats are going to go full bore for this? Do you think the moderate Republicans like Susan Collins are going to buy it, bearing in mind that she ultimately did vote for Kavanaugh's confirmation, I believe, Murkowski and Collins, right? So in any case, how do you think this is all going to play out?
Well, we did see Joni Ernst sort of flip-flop on this. She was very opposed to Hegseth just last month, and then has kind of tamped down some of her criticism in recent weeks after meeting with him several times. There's reports or rumors that she's not running for re-election, so she would be sort of a top person to vote against him because she wouldn't have to fear the political ramifications of doing so. So the fact that she's potentially getting on board, I think, bodes well for Pete Hegseth. But all of that being said, at the same time, today you have, or this week rather, you have the House Ethics Committee changing its tune on releasing the report into Matt Gaetz, the former congressman who was supposed to be a pick for Secretary of State before dropping out, allegedly having sexual relations with an underage woman. I think she was 17 at the time, according to the allegations. They're now going to release that report publicly, even though he's already moved on and is going to apparently work at One America News Network. So the fact that they're willing to do that suggests to me that people in the Senate, Democrats, are not going to let the Hegseth allegations, no matter how minor, slip by. They're going to use this as an opportunity until the very end. The question is whether senators learned enough from the Kavanaugh hearings to know what a smear and slander job this is, and they're willing to resist whatever pressure comes to confirm Pete Hegseth anyway. I give it maybe like a 50-50 chance at this point.
I think that Pete Hegseth survived the initial onslaught by going on offense, and this is a perfect illustration of how you have to respond to prevail, because the left and really the uniparty regime expects that in the face of that kind of onslaught, our side is going to cave. I think that the drinking and womanizing allegations are, totally disingenuous, because we're talking about Washington, D.C. here. We're talking about a Washington, D.C. that was perfectly fine with Teddy Kennedy sitting in the Senate for decades, was perfectly fine with Bill Clinton as president. It's obvious hypocrisy, and it's to create a sort of moral veneer to mask what they really don't like about Pete Hegseth, which is that, one, he's Donald Trump's choice for this position, but two, he's not part of the military establishment. And he's not part of the military establishment in no small part because what is he focusing on in his commentary, in his writings before? It's all about the lethality of the military. It's about competence. It's about having a dominant fighting force. It's about everything. It's about merits, essentially, and everything else he views as an excess that's to the detriment of having the most lethal fighting force in the world, which exists to kill enemies and destroy things, and ultimately to be so strong that you don't even have to engage in those acts, that it's deterrent enough how strong we are. So I really don't think it's at all about the merits, the pushback on him. And I think the fact that you had pushback on Republicans who seemed to go wobbly here, and that seemed to change their posture in response to it, I think is an important sign because ultimately, this is really, I view it as another litmus test for do you know what time it is or not? Forget about, whether Republicans, establishment Republicans are going to shrink in the face of allegations that come from the left. If you give Democrats this scalp, it starts a feeding frenzy. And so if you were just purely doing the kind of cost benefit analysis, is it prudent to let any head roll when you know that it's ultimately going to lead to destabilizing the entire agenda potentially by stopping the president from having the personnel he wants and needs? Now, for the establishment, they may want that ultimately, but for the movement, that's why these are sort of litmus test kind of moments. And we'll see. I think it's supposed to be slated that he's going to have a hearing on January 14th. So we'll know pretty soon in the new year how this is trending. But I think the fact that he survived the initial onslaught is probably a good sign going forward for what the nomination fight's going to look like.
Yeah, I mean, I was somewhat involved. Like I reported out along with other people that the news about DeSantis potentially being tapped for this job was real, and that Trump was really having second thoughts. And that, I mean, other piece of reporting said that was true. But I ultimately think, despite personally having being very fond of DeSantis, having worked for the guy, that the analysis that you can't give the Senate Republicans, weak-kneed Senate Republicans, a second, that you need to get your guys through, and that the especially not based on BS anonymous allegations, and a lot of pressure has been put on those senators from constituents, influencers elsewhere, and it seems like they've realized that this is not the place they want to fight unless they're, somebody like Murkowski or Collins. But we're eventually going to prevail here, and I think it's a good thing.
All right, we'll go ahead and move on to my topic, which is the latest releases from Barry Loudermilk's investigation into the January 6th committee. And the big news is that there have been text messages and other communications released between Liz Cheney, Alyssa Farah, and Cassidy Hutchinson that suggest witness tampering on behalf of Liz Cheney. There's a particularly damning message in which Alyssa Farah reaches out to Cassidy Hutchinson, who was, you might recall, the former low-level White House staffer who accused Trump of grabbing the wheel of the beast and trying to get Secret Service to go to the Capitol on January 6th, which has been denied by several firsthand witnesses. The text message from Alyssa to Cassidy suggests that Cassidy should talk to Liz Cheney, who was one of the few Republican members of the January 6th committee, without her lawyer present. And she's accused of basically manipulating Cassidy into giving this false testimony that would damage Trump, as opposed to just going in and telling the truth at the behest of her lawyer. My understanding is she also fired her initial lawyer in favor of a different one, according to some of the communications. And one of the other big line items out of this report is about this text message that was shown during the J6 committee hearings that was apparently completely out of context. The text message was one to Cassidy Hutchinson where it said something about Mark Meadows told me you have your deposition tomorrow. He knows you're loyal and you're going to do the right thing when you go in for your deposition. This was framed as by the J6 committee as being witness tampering itself, that they were basically threatening Cassidy that she had to go in and only defend Trump if she were to be perceived as being loyal and keeping her job in Trump orbit. But Ben Williamson, who was a staffer in the White House at the time, revealed yesterday that he was the author of this text message. And it actually came following a phone call he received from Cassidy Hutchinson, in which she was the one fretting about loyalty and being perceived as a traitor. And he had told her on the phone call, all you have to do is go in and be honest. Nobody's going to blame you for, appearing for this subpoena. And then he followed up with this text message to kind of reassure her. But all that was shown in the J6 committee hearings was the text message without any of the extra context. So this has led to a lot of calls for Liz Cheney to be brought in to be investigated over her alleged witness tampering. And I think Loudermilk generally has done a really great job of exposing a lot of the corruption of the January 6th committee. The way the committee was entirely one-sided and meant to just get Trump rather than actually investigate what really happened and what led to January 6th. So I'm curious to get your all's take. One of the things that I'm really interested about this, and this is something I'm working on reporting out and will be in the February Spectator magazine, is how the stock of all of these people who decided to flip on Trump for the sake of getting their MSNBC, CNN, The View gigs, or getting some work in sort of the never Trump resistance has fallen dramatically since Trump won re-election and is now back in power. I think they probably bet on the wrong horse and maybe are regretting their decision, because if they had simply been honest from the get, they would have been still working for the president-elect or in Republican circles to some extent. But now they're basically out on this island of this small group of anti-never Trump former Republicans who basically have no say-so, no power whatsoever, and a lot of them not really doing any meaningful work. So I'm curious about that dynamic of these people choosing to do what maybe would have been socially or professionally easier post J6, but now looks like a huge miscalculation.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable that, Liz Cheney knew, she's a lawyer. She knew she had ethical obligations, first and foremost, not to talk to an unrepresented client, and then did so anyway. And then I think the second thing is just, it seems like Cassidy Hutchinson's a pretty remarkable liar. Like, I was watching Ben Williamson talk on Twitter. He had a very interesting thread where he was talking about what he went through because of just a flat out lie from Cassidy Hutchinson, and how they mischaracterized his chats with her, where he was saying, you can go ahead and testify. He's going to be fine with it. Like, go testify, tell the truth. Nobody care. And they tried to mischaracterize that as like, oh, he was trying to witness tamper and get her to testify falsely at the committee. These guys were Cheney and Kinzinger and the others were so obviously motivated by Trump hatred that it's clear they were willing to do just about anything on this committee to try and hurt him. And, I think the American people saw through it. And I think ultimately, yeah, Liz Cheney deserves real trouble. She was trying to, she was part of the whole movement to try and jail Trump for the rest of his life and ruin the lives of any number of Republican operatives. And if she violated the law and tampered with witnesses on her own and helped suborn false testimony, she should go to jail.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also, I think it brings up the larger question. Trump has put out some lawsuits, right? Media outlets, pollsters, suing for defamation. I don't know how likely he is to succeed in a lot of those, other than the one with, I think, CNBC that already settled. Maybe I'm misremembering who settled with him, but one already settled. But I think this is long overdue. There are a lot of people who crossed the line because they didn't like Trump. And by cross the line, I don't mean that they were politically out on an ice floe the way that Amber says the Never Trumpers are, which I agree with, right? They crossed legal lines, and that's true inside and outside of government. And to the extent that even we can put through some of these folks, or Trump can put through some of these folks through the same kind of legal trouble that ultimately resolves in their favor, the way that the left put Daniel Penny through, for example, I think it's worth it. There needs to be a deterrence reestablished for just outright lying in an incredibly damaging way because you don't like somebody's politics. There needs to be some kind of, and we have a very high bar for defamation. We can discuss whether the Sullivan standard should be reopened, right? But I think even just making life difficult for people who obviously lied, obviously stepped over the line, in many cases broke the law, just out of hysterically despising the incoming president in 2016. I think there needs to be a deterrent reestablished for this. And there's going to be a lot of cries, I guess, in the next 4 years about vengeance or about banana republic type punishment. And in fact, what's happening is a restoration of justice, a restoration of the law actually applying to everyone, even people who are in power, who are simply hysterical about Donald Trump and thought. I honestly think a lot of these people in their minds, they think that they were taking out Hitler, right? And what wouldn't be justified in taking out Hitler? And they justify it to themselves that way, but many of them broke the law in very serious ways. And there's no reason that Donald Trump should turn the other cheek on that.
Yeah, it's not vengeance or retribution. It's vigorously applying the rule of law to lawfare and people who acted in a totally lawless and tyrannical fashion. Because if there is not justice meted out, there is no deterrent to far worse behavior down the road. And every time retribution or vengeance comes up, in my view, that should be the response. I think it's worth noting there's definitely compelling evidence here of witness tampering and perjury, and this is part and parcel of a report that I think beyond the headlines associated with Cheney's essentially rigging the deck essentially here has some other pretty important revelations, and I think to Amber's point, it illustrates a really job well done, frankly, from the chairman of the House Administration Oversight Committee, Chairman Loudermilk here, because there have been some other reports as well that they've put out that have been really illuminating. But for one thing, it shows you that he shows the total obstruction that the J6 committee engaged in, starting from the top with Benny Thompson in terms of massive reams of documents, millions of pages equivalent in terms of data size of documents not recovered and produced to this oversight committee. You also had the fact that the committee itself was illegitimate by any number of measures, by House rules, something that he goes into. A few more things that I found that were pretty interesting. The committee wanted to compare FBI interview notes of Cassidy Hutchinson with the testimony that she gave. The FBI apparently never turned over the 302. So that's interesting. Maybe it's something that'll come across Kash Patel's desk ultimately. Another interesting thing, Jack Smith actually got documents either from the J6 committee or from the White House that this oversight committee never obtained. It seems like there's coordination there, notable, and something that had been rumored for a while. Beyond that, he shows in the report, Loudermilk, that the IGs involved in investigating January 6th, particularly at DOD, appear to have been wholly captured, and not only did a poor job, but then were very hostile, it seems, towards the committee in the committee's effort to get information, looking at the work that the DOD IG did. And then last but not least, also in the report, Loudermilk sort of indicates that his committee and the House Judiciary Committee are going to put forth a report on the J6 pipe bombers, which remains one of the open threads here. So that'll be fascinating. There's all manner of speculation because the government seems to have had no leads in connection with the pipe bombs. All manner of questions around it. Kamala Harris being so close, in such close proximity to one of them. How could that have possibly happened, et cetera? Maybe we'll get some answers down the road. And without the transparency, ultimately, you can't have the accountability, like pushing for the FBI to look into Liz Cheney for potential perjury.
And right back to you, Ben, with a perfect segue for your segment on the DOJ spying on Congress.
Well, to another kind of retroactive investigation, years in the making. A few years back, we found out that, among others, the incoming the FBI director designate, Kash Patel, as well as senior staffers like Jason Foster, who was a chief investigator for Chuck Grassley on the Judiciary Committee, that their communications had been subpoenaed for several years, and that they were secretly subpoenaed under non-disclosure orders that the DOJ went to the court, said, please don't essentially let this target know that we're going to collect their non-content records, so-called. So their text logs, the phone numbers that they dialed, email traffic, etc. Not the actual messages or correspondence, but who called who or sent a message to who, at what time, etc. And obviously, you could piece together a map of someone's life essentially if you have even not the content, but just the communications records themselves. There were these non-disclosure orders associated with them, and the DOJ IG went out and did a report regarding the DOJ's investigation of the very congressional staffers who had oversight jurisdiction with respect to the DOJ. This was in particular from the 2020 plus time period. So right around, of course, Russiagate, among other things. Kash Patel was then a top investigator on HIPSI, the House Intelligence Committee, of course, one of the principal authors of the so-called Nunes memo, which exposed the FISA court abuse with respect to Carter Page, and investigated a lot of other things around Russiagate. Jason Foster and others were doing the same on the Senate side. But it wasn't just them. It was 43 staffers who had their communications records subpoenaed by DOJ on the predicate that there was an unauthorized leak, an illegal leak of data, of information that went to the Washington Post, the New York Times, et cetera. And it involved the reporting on the Carter Page FISA warrant applications and FISA warrants. So with the predicate of the leak, the DOJ said, we have to find out who's leaking this information, and we've limited the universe in part to 43 staffers in Washington and 2 congressmen as well. The 2 congressmen are reportedly Adam Schiff and Eric Swalwell, interestingly enough, and it appears, based upon the DOJ IG report, that it was actually a Democrat staffer who tipped off authorities to the fact that they may have been the leakers. So that's interesting in and of itself. But the big picture story here, beyond the fact that the leaker was never charged or discovered, apparently, is the fact that the DOJ could actually go about secretly subpoenaing the records of the very people tasked with overseeing the DOJ and who were looking into, at the time this occurred, DOJ malfeasance and corruption, particularly around Russiagate. And what the IG found is basically that despite its findings and its communications with the DOJ, there's very little recourse, essentially, or there's very little protection, essentially, for the overseers to not fear that the other branch of government potentially threaten them, chill them by threatening to subpoena their records. When the feds went to the courts asking for these non-disclosure orders, they didn't disclose that they were targeting members of Congress or their staffers. They used boilerplate language, and essentially the only justification they put forth was essentially the proximity of these individuals to the information that was leaked, and then the timing by which they had obtained that information and when the leaks came out. So this, to me, looks incredibly chilling when you have government agencies that can go out and threaten to pull your communications to the extent you're investigating them. And there doesn't really seem to have been any remedy for it. Basically, there's a revised congressional investigations policy now where there's more notification of more senior officials within among prosecutors about what is transpiring, but there's not really authorization required, let's say, from the Attorney General. And even if there was authorization, by the way, what happens when you have a corrupt Attorney General to begin with? So there are massive separation of powers issues here, privacy issues, speech and debate related issues with respect to Congress. It's an incredibly chilling report, but there's very little teeth to it because we're talking about the DOJ IG. So there's a question for the next Congress, which is, do there need to be laws on the books to prevent a weaponized agency from going about threatening its overseers in Congress? For my money, usually the congressional committees seem to be captured entities of the agencies they're supposed to oversee. But nevertheless, a very chilling report. Of course, a report that where we're only learning about what transpired 7 years after the events in question, which is maddening. The only positive thing I see is that you've got someone who is the target here, Kash Patel, who's going to go into the FBI and hopefully clean house and prevent these sorts of abuses. But curious as to what you all make of some of these revelations from the DOJ IG.
Man, I hope I'm alive when all of the papers from this period are actually made public, because it's going to be quite a revelation. the only thing I have to add to what Ben said is that there is a long-term imbalance between, and this is not a new problem, right? This is an Edgar Hoover era problem between congressmen in particular, but also even senators, like generally are elected officials, and the permanent intelligence bureaucracy, the latter of which stays around administration to administration, gathers intelligence, and often use it against elected officials. I mean, that I genuinely don't think that's conspiracy theory. I think it's fact. That there is a real imbalance between the bureaucracy in DC and the people that we elect to allegedly control it. And I really hope, by the way, we started this with the report, of course, from Loudermilk. Loudermilk himself, a congressman who has done incredible and lonely work trying to introduce really good bills about how to reform the bureaucracy in the civil service that deserve more attention. I hope they will get more attention in this new era. But yeah, there's some deep structural problems. This is not something we talked about, the balance between vengeance and justice in the last segment. As happy as I am to see justice be done to individuals who abuse their power in this way, the real solution is not only to go ahead and prosecute people who broke the law or inappropriately used their power, but also to permanently shift the balance that has gone so far out of whack. I mean, it's been increasing since the progressive era, really for a century, right? The balance between the bureaucrats who are supposed to execute the policies of the elected officials and the power that they themselves wield, that is all out of proportion and is totally illegitimate in our system. We just have this entire fourth branch that is essentially not only making governmental decisions and policy decisions, but actively, in some cases, blackmailing or putting pressure on our elected officials to prevent oversight and to prevent the appropriate small d democratic control of our government. And that is something that's going to require a larger and deeper shift that is probably going to require legislation, but is at minimum going to require a lot of courage and repeated ability to stand up to people screeching that because it's been done this way for a few decades, that it's somehow legitimate. It isn't. It's completely unconstitutional and illegitimate.
I don't have much to add here except for the fact that when you look at this story being covered in mainstream media outlets, all of the headlines make sure to say Trump DOJ, as if Trump himself directed the DOJ to be spying on, of course, the two names they list are Schiff and I forgot the other one. Sorry. Swalwell, Schiff and Swalwell. Yes. Luckily, they're mostly irrelevant now. But yeah, their names are mentioned at the top of the report, and it's Trump DOJ to make it seem like he was using the lawfare to target his opponents. And then sort of deep down in the stories, they bury the fact that Kash Patel was a part of this as well, and that Trump had nothing to do with it. So it's just amazing how no matter what the story is, the framing is somehow always Trump's fault.
Yeah, I mean, I can't stand that. I mean, it's the same thing that Kamala tried to do with like blaming the Trump administration for funding gender like transition surgeries in prisons. It's like, no, that wasn't Trump himself. That was just like some low-level bureaucrat who did that. You know, everybody knows that Trump himself, if asked about that, would not be a fan, duh. And similarly here, trying to blame Trump himself for the DOJ running wild under his administration when it was running wild against him personally in any number of different ways, from the word go with James Comey, et cetera. I think that's totally ridiculous. And I think it's also, you know, hopefully I'm really happy with the DOJ appointments, in particular somebody like Harmeet Dillon. We might talk more about that later, but I think there's going to be a reckoning at DOJ, and it's absolutely deserved.
Just to jump in here with one sentence, when I see in Washington, D.C., when I come in for like a meeting or something, when I see people going out of the DOJ wearing proudly the little beanies that Harmeet Dillon knits, that's when I know there's a new era and the DOJ has been restored.
That's so much fun. I didn't even know that. That's amazing. All right, we're going to go ahead and move into final thoughts. Who would like to go first?
So I'll jump really briefly. Worth noting, a little coda to the last story. The Inspector General, of course, says there's no sign, there's no evidence of retaliation that they could see in the subpoenaing of the records. But obviously, the chill is there. And this is, of course, an episode that we know about. How many people have had their records secretly subpoenaed that we don't know about or that are in process right now? And the time hasn't lapsed on when the non-disclosure orders go out, expire, and the companies can actually tell the targets, hey, someone asked for your communications records. We didn't even mention before the fact that the IG also came out with a report on informants on January 6th. And there also, the headlines, of course, were misleading. The headline could have been, why didn't Christopher Wray want to tell us that there were 26 confidential human sources of the FBI present on January 6th, that 13 of them went into restricted area, and then none of the 13 got charged, unlike many other January 6ers. Notable story, another conspiracy theory that only takes a few years to come to fruition. We still don't know many questions like what were the communications between these sources and the FBI like? The FBI says they didn't have any, I forget the technical term, but undercover agents on the ground, but there could have been other undercovers from them associated with them, or undercovers associated with other law enforcement agencies as well. We're still not even close yet to the full truth to the extent we'll ever get it, which again is remarkable. And it's also worth noting that the FBI itself went after, appears to have retaliated against one agent who merely raised questions about whether Wray might have perjured himself in testimony around confidential human sources being present when he made a report up the chain pointing to the New York Times, actually, I think, which indicated that there were confidential human sources on the ground on J6. So it's just cover-ups upon cover-ups and corruption upon corruption. But if, to the extent this is the last episode for the year, hopefully what we can see in the new year is a renewed purpose and pursuit of liberty and justice when you have an administrative state apparatus minimally, not to mention two houses of Congress to some extent, that are in GOP hands. We should expect the worst, but hope for the best, and all endeavor to fight for it in the year ahead.
Yeah, my final thought, I guess, is that once again, we've confirmed that the worst people in our government are always theater kids, former theater kids. There's a video circulating of Ketanji Brown Jackson, who apparently is very short, which I didn't realize, like extremely short, in a queer version of Romeo and Juliet on the stage. And it just confirms to me like this particular type of person who has been running Washington, D.C. for quite some time. They're usually the people who came in because they watched West Wing. And I hope in the new year that'll be the end of theater kid occupied government in Washington, D.C., at least for some time. That being said, happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. It's certainly been a roller coaster of a year, but I hope we're ending on a high note. I know that I shouldn't say that because we've still got a couple of weeks to go in 2024, but some incredible victories, and I'm truly optimistic about the future of the country in 2025. That's something I never thought I would say a year ago, or certainly 4 years ago.
Look, I think Ketanji Brown Jackson was incredible in that Broadway adaptation. I think she should quit being a Supreme Court justice and just go full time on her dream of being a theater star. I think everyone would be much better off. My final thoughts, though, are on the mysterious drones that have been spotted all up and down the eastern seaboard. We still don't have an answer as to what exactly those are. Trump has speculated that the government knows exactly what they are, but are not telling us. Which seems quite likely. There was actually a press call on background with members of DOD, FBI, DOJ, and the FAA and DHS on Saturday. And they were like, oh, well, we're quite sure that some of these drones are from private operators because that's obviously legal in the United States. Some of them could be military drones conducting exercises. But then they made an interesting admission, which is that some of them have been caught flying over restricted airspace, over military bases, military training facilities, etc., which was something that they had previously denied. And they said that there were 5,000 tips that came in with alleged sightings of the drones, and there were 100 worth following up on, but did not indicate what those follow-ups led to. We keep hearing the same refrain, which is, well, we're not sure what all of them are, but don't worry, there's no public safety threat. And obviously that's not reassuring to people, because you can't have it both ways. It can't be that we don't know what they are, but also they're not a threat. It's one or the other, right? Either we know what they are and they're not a threat, or we don't know what they are and we're not sure if they're a threat. So naturally, the government's unwillingness to tell us what exactly these drones are has led to all kinds of conspiracy theories, which I think is totally reasonable, and has led to inflamed fears over whether these could be from foreign adversaries, particularly since the Biden administration let a Chinese spy balloon fly across the entire continental US just a couple of years ago. I know I'm going to keep following the drone story, because I think it's just the latest example of how this trickle truthing from the government sort of breeds the exact distrust in institutions that they claim to despise.
Yeah, I'll just, one quick heads up. So Article 3 Project, my organization filed an ethics complaint against this federal judge who went to the pages of the New York Times to complain about Sam Alito and how awful he was and how he had done something unethical. And just, we filed an ethics complaint against this judge for doing so. And we found out this week that we prevailed, that the Fourth Circuit agreed with our reasoning, that the judge had behaved unethically, and the judge had to write this incredibly humbling page-long letter explaining how he was so sorry about the terrible mistake he had made and was never going to do it again. And I take personal satisfaction about this, because it's extremely hard to humble a federal judge, and has a lawyer who has been, berated by federal judges before, watching one of these people in their robes having to submit themselves and be obsequious is just a wonderful thing. And it's also really good just so that these leftist judicial activists find out what's up. There's also some other interesting stuff happening with, now that Trump's been elected, a number of judges who announced their retirement, taking senior status, are retracting that, a very political move. And so you should keep an eye on if we can force these judges to face consequences, because they're not supposed to do anything political. You're allowed to quit whenever you want, but quitting and then withdrawing your resignation based on a political event happening, very, very sketchy. So that's all.
Thank you for that update, Will. That's great news. And to all of our viewers, have a Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Holidays, and a Happy New Year. We are going to see you for our first podcast after the break, the first week after New Year's Day. And with that, on behalf of Ben, Will, and Inez, I'm Amber Duke, and we will see you all in a couple of weeks. Enjoy your holiday season.